A man stormed into the gang's den all by himself. He then pulled out every last penny he had saved. He wanted to use the money to buy a prostitute's freedom. Instead, his gesture was met with mockery from the gang boss, that $10,000 would only rent her for 1 month. The man didn't say another word. He turned around and headed for the door. But he wasn't planning to leave. He was making sure these scum couldn't escape his sight. He quickly scanned the entire room, sizing up everyone's position and the weapons they might be carrying. It took him just 6 seconds. A flawless cleanup plan had already taken shape. He lifted his wrist and started the stopwatch, planning to finish everything in 25 seconds. As one of the underlings approached him voluntarily, his cleanup operation officially began. The weapons in others' hands all became his cleaning tools. The gang members in the room were all wiped out quickly, until the last man collapsed to the ground. He glanced down at his watch and found that the whole thing had taken 28 seconds. Being 3 seconds overtime made him feel a little disappointed. Looking at the gang boss, whose face was frozen in disbelief, the man finally slowly explained why he'd done all this. His name was Brian. He used to be the top agent at MI6, but after surviving several near-death missions, he made up his mind to quit the business for good. So he faked his own death and hid in a small town, hoping for a quiet life. During this peaceful period of time, he met a girl named Sarah. She was around the same age as his late daughter, yet she had unfortunately become a well-known local prostitute. But here's the thing, Sarah hated this life from the bottom of her heart. She just had no other choice. Before long, Sarah's phone suddenly rang. The caller was her so-called father, who was also the pimp forcing her to sell her body. Staring at that sleazy £300 client, Sarah was terrified, but she didn't dare to refuse. She could only wipe away her tears, walk out of the restaurant. Brian watched her fading figure. His heart was heavy with emotions he couldn't shake off. The next night, he brought a cake specially, planning to visit Sarah, but after searching everywhere, he couldn't find her. In the days that followed, Sarah seemed to have vanished into thin air, until that night, the cafe owner finally told him the truth. Sarah had been beaten severely. He rushed to the hospital immediately, and saw Sarah lying in bed, her face covered in bruises. At that very moment, Brian made a firm decision. He had to do something for this girl. From Sarah's friend, he learned it. The one who'd beaten her was none other than her so-called father, who was also the notorious local gang leader, Ivan. Following Sarah's friend's directions, Brian found Ivan's residence, and then, the scene at the beginning of the story unfolded. Brian thought the matter was settled there, and then, little did he know, a much bigger storm was brewing. It turned out that behind Ivan loomed the powerful presence of the Russian Mafia. Ivan's death dealt a heavy blow to the Mafia. When the boss behind the scenes got the news, he flew into a rage. He immediately sent out his top enforcer, David, to go to Boston and investigate the murder. David was not only a meticulous thinker, but also a former Special Forces soldier. He just took one look at Ivan's crime scene photos and concluded that the killer was no ordinary man. Sure enough, it didn't take long for David to track down the key lead. He disguised himself as a police officer and knocked on Brian's front door. He asked Brian about the details of the case, but to his surprise, Brian's answers were watertight, without a single flaw. But right after that, David pulled out a photo. Sarah's friend was dead. It turned out that the girl had already been silenced by David. Brian's mind was reeling with shock, but his expression remained calm as ever. Seeing that the interrogation wasn't going anywhere, David had no choice but to leave in frustration. After this face-to-face confrontation, David became even more convinced that he'd found the right target, and Brian also clearly realized. This time, he was up against a formidable opponent. That same night, Brian went to the cafe to read as usual, but shortly after he sat down, a man dressed as a worker walked in and tried to strike up a conversation with him, only to have his disguise seen through by Brian in an instant, because his hands were covered with calluses and scars from firing guns. Seeing that his cover was blown, the man dropped the axe. He was the hitman sent by David to capture Brian alive. At that moment, David was keeping watch outside the cafe, waiting for his man to bring Brian out. But just then, a truck drove past, blocking his view completely. In that split second, Brian pressed the stopwatch on his wrist and ended the fight in a mere 5 seconds. After the truck drove away, Brian didn't choose to flee immediately. Instead, he walked out of the cafe and took a photo in David's direction. David didn't dare to make a move in public, fearing trouble, so he held back. As soon as Brian left, he led his men to break into Brian's house, but it was already empty. On the other side, Brian was watching. David and his gang's every move closely through surveillance cameras. He left some motion sickness pills on the table, along with a copy of his flight ticket reservation, trying to create the illusion that he'd fled far away. However, this trick didn't fool the sharp-witted David. Brian knew he was up against a tough adversary, so he contacted his old CIA colleagues for help. From his colleagues, he not only obtained the complete files on this gang, but also discovered that the gang's influence had already infiltrated the local police station. He knew deep down, to solve the problem once and for all, he had to uproot this entire criminal empire. Brian decided to take the initiative. First, he tracked down a corrupt cop on the gang's payroll and took him down with just a few punches. Then he locked the car doors tightly and pumped tear gas into the vehicle. Seeing that the corrupt cop refused to talk, he simply locked him in the car and walked away. Eventually, the corrupt cop couldn't stand the tear gas anymore and obediently led Brian to the gang's money laundering den. Brian posed as the cop's subordinate and quickly got an audience with the den's boss. The boss noticed that Brian was a stranger, and when he saw the bruises on the cop's face, he immediately became wary. Brian also picked up on the man's suspicion, so he deliberately asked to see the man's gun. The arrogant gang leader took the bait without hesitation and pointed the gun directly at him. But the next second, Brian took control of the entire situation in an instant. Under Brian's threat, the leader had no choice but to give in. He not only dismissed all the workers at the den, but also gave each of them $10,000 as compensation. Then Brian made the corrupt cop call the police. Soon enough, the police raided and shut down the money laundering den. But Brian also knew this corrupt cop must have had a backup plan. Otherwise, he wouldn't have survived this long. After some persuasion from Brian, the corrupt cop handed over a crucial USB drive. It contained not only evidence of government officials taking bribes, but also the gang's shipping and transaction records. But Brian wasn't satisfied with this. Now that he'd started, he might as well go all out. That night, he sneaked into the seaside oil refinery alone and blew up the entire refinery owned by the Russian Mafia. Along with all the oil pipelines, he was like a dark knight cutting through the night, taking on the entire massive criminal syndicates single-handedly, with factories and cargo ships being taken down one after another. The gang boss suffered huge losses. He gave David an ultimatum, ordering him to kill Brian before dawn. But at the moment, David was completely powerless against Brian. Just when he was at his wit's end, he spotted Brian's old colleagues following him, and a sinister plan immediately formed in his mind. He sent his men to kidnap all of Brian's old colleagues and force one of them, named Frank, to call Brian, threatening to kill all the hostages if he didn't arrive at the designated location within 30 minutes. Brian knew full well that going there would be a suicide mission, but this mess had all started because of him. His old colleagues were innocent, so he had to go. On the other side, David had already set up an ambush, waiting for Brian to walk right into the trap, but he had seriously underestimated Brian's capabilities. Brian, who'd come to the rendezvous, had long anticipated that his phone would be tracked, so he pulled a diversionary tactic, leaving David chasing thin air. Furious, David ordered his men to kill the hostages immediately. Just as the situation reached a critical point, a loud, piercing music suddenly blared throughout the scene. This was all Brian's doing. He knew exactly that the enemy would send someone to the control room to turn off the music, and he'd already set an ambush there. Brian hid the body, then used Frank to lure another guard out. After that, he told Frank to lead everyone to escape through the back door, while he stayed behind to take on the remaining enemies alone. Even though David had a huge number of men on his side, Brian knew every inch of the mall's layout like the back of his hand. He first cut off all the power in the mall, then spread a layer of sand on the floor. When someone walked by, they would definitely bend down to check their feet, and that would be the perfect moment to strike. The unlucky underling didn't even get a chance to scream for help. Before being taken out, the other gang members heard the commotion and crept over cautiously to check what was going on. The moment he looked up, his hand just reached for the gun at his waist. David arrived just in time and shot Brian in the arm. Brian had no choice but to take cover temporarily. He found a piece of iron sheet and heated it red hot with fire, then pressed it directly against his wound to stop the bleeding. He didn't make a single sound the entire time. Next, he set up a flamethrower between the shelves. After seeing what had happened to their comrade, none of the others dared to approach easily, but as one of the underlings stepped back, Brian was already standing silently behind him, watching their brothers die one by one without explanation. One of them finally couldn't contain his fear anymore and started slashing wildly at the walls. Brian seized the opportunity, quickly darted out from the shadows, and stabbed the man in the shoulder with a knife. But to his surprise, the man was incredibly tough. Even after taking several stab wounds, he was still going strong. Brian caught sight of another piece of broken glass nearby. He threw it with all his remaining strength, grabbed the glass and stabbed it deep into the man's neck. The man let out a painful howl and gradually drew his last breath. Just then, Frank, who was worried about Brian's safety, ran back, but as soon as he helped Brian up, he was shot in the thigh. The two of them quickly took cover behind a shelf. Their position had been completely exposed. They had to find a way to break out. Brian told Frank to reach the power distribution box in 40 seconds and turn on all the power in the mall. While he went to draw away another enemy, Frank ran for his life, keeping his eyes glued to his watch, fearing that he might be even 1 second late. David realized what he was up to and chased closely behind him. Just as David was about to pull the trigger, Frank managed to turn on all the power. Hearing the explosion, Frank quickly ducked into a room. He locked the door tightly and aimed his gun at the window. It wasn't long before David arrived at the door. At this critical moment of life and death, David was shot by a nail gun. The one who pulled the trigger was none other than Brian. Everyone had expected an epic battle between the two top fighters, but what they got instead was a one-sided beatdown. David never figured it out until his last breath, who this man was. 3 days later, Brian traveled all the way to Russia and tracked down the gang boss's hideout. He staged an ingenious accident and electrocuted the boss to death, completely wiping out the entire gang syndicate. After everything settled down, Brian returned to his ordinary life once again. One day, he ran into Sarah on the street by chance. The Sarah standing before him had long shed her former gloominess. She looked radiant and full of vitality. She told Brian that she'd found a job and was working hard to pursue her dream of becoming a singer. She didn't ask Brian how he'd saved her. She just smiled and waved him goodbye.